Welcome to a story that I believe will touch the hearts of everyone. This is not just a tale of struggle and justice, but also a journey in search of hope, love, and family. Join me on this journey, where every moment is filled with deep emotions and meaningful lessons. I promise, you won't just follow a story, you'll feel it in every breath. The city pulsed with life in the early morning rush. Towering skyscrapers cast long shadows over the bustling streets, where impatient honks and hurried footsteps filled the air. Antonio de Luca, a sharp-suited millionaire, strode along the crowded sidewalk with his leather briefcase in hand. Despite his towering stature and confident demeanor, his mind raced with numbers and negotiations, his thoughts consumed by the business empire he had painstakingly built. Amid the chaos, a muffled sob caught his attention. Antonio slowed his stride, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the crowd. On the edge of the pavement, near a lamppost streaked with old graffiti, a little girl huddled on the ground. She looked entirely out of place among the tide of busy commuters. Her frail figure shook with every sob, her messy brown hair clinging to her dusty face. The worn dress she wore hung limply on her thin frame, her bare feet tucked beneath her as though she could make herself invisible. Antonio hesitated, his grip tightening on his briefcase. He wasn't the type to get involved. His schedule demanded precision, and this interruption would only throw off the tightly packed day he had planned. Yet something about the girl's trembling form, her quiet despair, pierced through his usual detachment. His shoes clicked softly on the pavement as he knelt beside her. "Hey," he said gently, his deep voice uncharacteristically soft. "Hey, little one, are you okay? What happened?" The girl flinched at his voice, her tear-filled eyes darting up to meet his. Her sobs only grew louder, her tiny hands clutching her arms as though she could hold herself together. Antonio's chest tightened. She couldn't have been older than 8, her innocence stark against the unforgiving city backdrop. He looked around, searching for anyone who might be with her, her mother, her father, anyone who might claim her. But the sea of strangers moved on, their faces indifferent. Antonio let out a slow breath, leaning in slightly. "Where are your parents? Are you lost?" Still, she didn't answer. Antonio glanced at his watch, the seconds ticking by like an unrelenting drumbeat in his head. His schedule screamed at him to leave, but his conscience rooted him to the spot. Finally, he extended his hand, his voice firm but kind. "Come on, let's find a quieter place. You're safe with me." The girl hesitated, her wide eyes flicking between his hand and his face. For a moment, Antonio thought she might bolt, but then, trembling, she placed her tiny hand in his. It was so light, so fragile, that it made Antonio's throat tighten. Without a word, he helped her to her feet, her sobs quieting just enough for him to hear the whispered chaos of the city again. Antonio led the girl through the bustling streets, his tall frame shielding her from the jostling crowd. His sharp eyes searched for a refuge, someplace where the noise and pace of the city could fall away. That's when he spotted Clara's cafe, its familiar green awning a beacon of warmth in the urban landscape. The cafe had been a favorite of his during his leaner years, a cozy, unpretentious place owned by the ever-kind Clara, who treated every customer like a family. Pushing the door open, Antonio felt the tension eased from his shoulders. The rich aroma of coffee and fresh pastries enveloped them, a comforting contrast to the harshness outside. Clara, a middle-aged woman with soft eyes and a welcoming smile, looked up from behind the counter. Her face lit up as she saw Antonio, though her expression quickly turned to concern when she noticed the girl clutching his hand. "Antonio?" Clara greeted warmly, stepping out from behind the counter. "Ha, what's this? Who is your little friend?" Antonio shook his head lightly. "I don't know. I found her on the street, crying, and she hasn't said a word." Clara's motherly instincts kicked in immediately. She crouched down to the girl's level, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "Oh, sweetheart, you must be so scared. Come here, sit down. I'll get you something warm." She guided the girl to a corner booth, the soft cushions swallowing her small frame. Within moments, Clara returned with a steaming cup of hot chocolate, the aroma sweet and inviting. "Here you go, dear," she said, placing the cup in front of her. "Drink this, it'll help." The girl stared at the cup, her hands trembling as they reached for it. She lifted it to her lips cautiously, taking a small sip. The warmth seemed to calm her slightly, her sobs reducing to quiet sniffles. Antonio watched her intently, his mind still racing. Who was she? What was she doing alone on the streets? As Clara sat down across from them, she gave Antonio a knowing look. "She's lucky you found her," Clara said softly. "Most people wouldn't stop." Antonio leaned back, his jaw tightening. "I couldn't just leave her there," he admitted, surprising himself with the truth in his words. He was a man of action, of logic. But this situation defied all his instincts. Clara smiled faintly, then turned her attention back to the girl. "Can you tell us your name, sweetheart?" The girl hesitated, her lips parting as though to speak. Finally, in a voice so small it was almost lost in the cafe's quiet hum, she whispered, "Sophia." Antonio felt a strange sense of relief at hearing her speak, though the sound of her name only deepened the mystery. "Sophia," he repeated softly. "That's a beautiful name." Sophia's gaze flicked between them, her trust clearly fragile but growing. Clara reached out, gently touching her hand. "Sophia, do you know where your parents are, or where you live?" Sophia shook her head, fresh tears pooling in her eyes. I don't have a home," she murmured, her voice breaking. "They left me." Antonio's chest tightened. He exchanged a glance with Clara, whose face reflected the same mix of shock and sadness. For a man used to solving problems with money and power, this was a situation that neither could fix with ease. Still, something inside him hardened with resolve. "You're not alone anymore," Antonio said firmly, his voice steady and sure. "We'll figure this out. Together." Sophia looked up at him, her eyes searching his for reassurance. For the first time, there was a flicker of hope in her gaze, fragile but real. Antonio nodded, his decision made. Whatever it took, he wouldn't let this little girl face the world on her own again. The warm, comforting atmosphere of Clara's cafe wrapped around them like a protective cocoon. Antonio leaned forward, his eyes steady on Sophia, who clutched the now empty cup of hot chocolate as if it were a lifeline. Her small hands trembled slightly, her knuckles pale against the chipped porcelain. "Take your time," Antonio said gently, his voice low and even. "No one's going to hurt you here." Sophia hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Clara sat beside her, her kind eyes filled with encouragement. "You're safe now, sweetheart," Clara added softly. "You can tell us anything." The little girl's chest rose and fell as she took a shaky breath. Her voice, barely audible, broke the silence. I ran away," she began, her words halting, "from the orphanage." Antonio exchanged a sharp glance with Clara, whose brow furrowed in concern. "Why did you run, Sophia?" Antonio asked, his tone careful, though his jaw tightened at the thought of what could have driven such a young girl to flee. Sophia's fingers gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening as she spoke. "I heard them talking," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The people who worked there, they said they were going to sell us." Antonio froze. The words hung in the air, heavy and dissonant against the cafe's gentle hum. He felt a surge of anger boil in his chest, hot and unfamiliar. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, her gasp barely contained. "Sal, you?" Antonio repeated, his voice low and sharp. "What do you mean?" Sophia nodded, her eyes wide with fear as she continued. "They didn't know I was listening. They said they had buyers for some of us, that they would take us away." Antonio's fists clenched under the table. He had heard of horrors like this in the news, distant tragedies that seemed worlds away from his carefully controlled life. But here it was, sitting across from him, embodied in this small, trembling girl. "You did the right thing by running," Clara said, her voice breaking with emotion. "My God, Sophia." Antonio leaned closer, his expression softening despite the storm brewing inside him. "Listen to me, Sophia," he said firmly. "You're safe now. I won't let anyone hurt you, but we need to make sure you're protected. We need help." Sophia looked at him with wary eyes, her trust fragile but growing. "Help?" she echoed, her voice small. "Yes," Clara interjected, her tone steady despite the worry etched on her face. "We know someone who can help. A lawyer." Antonio nodded, glancing at Clara. "Mr. Valdez," he said, the name sparking a memory. "You've mentioned him before." Clara nodded. "He's a good man. He's handled some tough cases, especially ones involving children. If anyone can figure out what to do, it's him." Sophia's eyes darted between the two adults, her fear still evident but now mingled with a flicker of hope. Antonio placed his hand gently on the table, palm up, inviting her trust. "Sophia, we're going to fix this. But we need to talk to Mr. Valdez to figure out the next step. Can you trust us?" Sophia hesitated, then gave the faintest nod, her small fingers brushing against his. Antonio felt a wave of determination solidify within him. He would see this through, no matter what it took. The cafe door chimed as Antonio stepped out with Sophia, the morning's bustle now muted by his focus. Clara followed closely behind, locking up the cafe for the day. "I'll come with you," she said. "Sophia needs all the support she can get." Antonio didn't argue. The sight of the little girl beside him, so fragile yet brave enough to escape such a nightmare, demanded every resource at his disposal. He pulled out his phone, dialing Mr. Valdez's office as they walked. "Antonio de Luca," he introduced himself when the secretary answered. "I need to speak with Mr. Valdez. It's urgent." Within minutes, arrangements were made. Mr. Valdez, intrigued by the brief details Antonio provided, agreed to see them immediately. Mr. Valdez's office was a far cry from Antonio's sleek corporate headquarters. The walls were lined with bookshelves overflowing with thick legal volumes, and the faint smell of leather and paper filled the air. Antonio had always respected the seasoned attorney, a man in his late 60s with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. Today he hoped that respect was well placed. Mr. Valdez greeted them with a firm handshake, his gaze immediately softening when he saw Sophia clutching Clara's hand. "Come in," he said, gesturing to the chairs around his desk. "Let's talk. If you find the story we bring today interesting, please comment great. If you feel the story is not attractive, please comment need more drama." Antonio explained the situation succinctly, his tone controlled but urgent. As he recounted Sophia's revelation, Mr. Valdez's expression grew darker, his lips pressing into a thin line. "This is serious," Mr. Valdez said after Antonio finished. "If what Sophia overheard is true, there's a criminal network involved. The first step is ensuring her safety." Sophia sat silently, her eyes fixed on the floor, as Clara gently rubbed her back. Antonio leaned forward, his voice firm. "What can we do? How do we protect her?" Mr. Valdez steepled his fingers, his mind clearly racing. "The first priority is to keep her away from anyone who might be looking for her. She needs to stay somewhere secure. "She can stay with me," Antonio said without hesitation. "I have the space, and I can ensure her safety." Clara nodded, her approval evident. That's a good idea. She'll feel safe with you." Mr. Valdez nodded slowly. That's a start. But we'll also need to alert the authorities. Not directly about Sophia, not yet. It's too risky if there's corruption involved, but I have contacts who can investigate quietly." Sophia's head snapped up at the mention of the authorities, her face pale. "No," she said, her voice rising. "They'll take me back." Antonio reached for her hand, his grip reassuring. "Sophia, listen to me. No one is taking you back there. Not while I'm here." Mr. Valdez's gaze softened as he addressed Sophia directly. "We won't let that happen, Sophia. But we need to act carefully. If we don't stop them, other kids might be in danger too." Sophia hesitated, her fear evident, but she nodded slowly, her trust in Antonio steadying her resolve. As they left the office, Antonio felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. Sophia clung to his hand, her small steps matching his stride. Clara walked beside them, her presence a steadying force. "We'll get through this," Antonio said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Sophia glanced up at him, her eyes wide but no longer filled with despair. For the first time, Antonio felt something shift within him, an unfamiliar but welcome sense of purpose that extended beyond his business empire. Protecting Sophia wasn't just a responsibility, it was a promise he intended to keep. The sun had dipped low in the sky by the time Antonio, Clara, and Sophia returned to Mr. Valdez's office. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, the gravity of Sophia's story weighing on everyone present. Antonio sat upright, his hands resting on the polished wood table, while Clara kept a protective arm around Sophia, who seemed smaller than ever in the oversized chair. Mr. Valdez leaned back in his seat, his steely eyes scanning the faces before him. His legal mind was already piecing together a strategy, but he knew this was no ordinary case. "This isn't something we can handle alone," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "I know someone who can help, a detective I trust completely. He has experience with cases like this. If anyone can uncover the truth and shut this operation down, it's Detective Ramiro." Antonio's brow furrowed. "Will he keep this confidential? The last thing we need is for word to get back to that orphanage before we're ready." Mr. Valdez gave a curt nod. "Ramiro is discreet, thorough, and relentless. He'll treat this as his top priority. Let me reach out to him." By the time Detective Ramiro arrived at the office, night had fully settled over the city. The man who stepped through the door exuded calm authority. He was in his early 40s with a clean-shaven face, sharp eyes that missed nothing, and an air of quiet confidence. His dark suit was practical rather than flashy, and the way he carried himself suggested a man who had seen the worst the world could offer, and still fought against it. "Mr. Valdez!" Ramiro greeted with a firm handshake before nodding at Antonio and Clara. His gaze softened when it landed on Sophia, who shrank slightly under his scrutiny. "This must be Sophia," he said gently, crouching to her level. "Hi there. My name's Ramiro. I'm here to make sure you're safe." Sophia hesitated, clinging to Clara's arm, but Antonio gave her an encouraging nod. "He's here to help, Sophia. You can trust him." After a moment, Sophia nodded, though her grip on Clara didn't loosen. Satisfied, Ramiro straightened and turned to the adults. "Mr. Valdez has given me the basics, but I'd like to hear everything again to make sure I have all the details." Antonio recounted the story with precision, his voice steady, even as the weight of the situation pressed on him. Clara chimed in occasionally, filling in smaller details, while Sophia remained quiet, her wide eyes fixed on the floor. When Antonio finished, Ramiro leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "If what Sophia says is true," he began, his tone measured, "this isn't just an isolated incident. It could be part of a larger trafficking network. These operations often target vulnerable children, moving them quickly and quietly through illegal channels." Antonio's fists clenched at the thought. "So, what's our first step?" Ramiro folded his hands on the table, his gaze intense. "First, we ensure Sophia's safety. She can't go back to the orphanage, not even close. Whoever's running this will have people watching for her. For now, I suggest she stays somewhere secure, preferably under your protection." He nodded at Antonio. "You seem capable of handling that, and with your connections to Carthage, we'll be easy on her." Antonio's voice was resolute. "She'll stay with me. My estate is gated and heavily secured. No one will get near her." Ramiro nodded approvingly. "Good, that buys us time. Meanwhile, I'll initiate a covert investigation into the orphanage. I have contacts who can infiltrate quietly. Staff, delivery drivers, even maintenance workers. The goal is to gather enough evidence to build a case without tipping anyone off. If I find traces, then we can both claim we've been aided by nature. If something breaks through, the blame must be hers." Clara looked worried. Well, how long will that take? Sophia's already been through so much." "It won't be immediate," Ramiro admitted. "Operations like this take time to dismantle. We need to identify everyone involved, from the low-level workers to the ones pulling the strings, but I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to bring them down as quickly as possible." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation and tension. Antonio wasted no time transforming his home into a fortress. Extra security cameras were installed, guards were placed at the gates, and he even moved Sophia into a room next to his, ensuring she was never far from his protection. Despite the circumstances, Antonio went out of his way to make Sophia feel at ease. He filled her room with soft blankets, toys, and books, trying to bring some semblance of normalcy to her fractured world. Clara visited daily, bringing warm meals and her gentle presence, which seemed to soothe Sophia's nerves. Meanwhile, Ramiro worked tirelessly behind the scenes. His phone buzzed constantly with updates from his team as they began their covert infiltration of the orphanage. They unearthed suspicious financial transactions, a revolving door of unvetted staff, and cryptic communication between the orphanage's director and unknown third parties. Slowly but surely, the puzzle began to take shape. One evening, Ramiro visited Antonio's estate to share his findings. The two men sat in Antonio's sprawling living room, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. Sophia was asleep upstairs, her small frame finally at peace after days of constant fear. Ramiro pulled out a tablet, showing Antonio a series of documents and photos. "These are the initial findings," he said, his tone grim. "We've confirmed irregularities in the orphanage's operations. Financial records show large sums of money being transferred to offshore accounts. And this," he tapped the screen, revealing a photo of a man stepping into a black SUV. "This is Marco Alvarez, a known trafficker. He's been seen entering and leaving the orphanage multiple times." Antonio's jaw tightened as he stared at the image. "And the director? Is she involved?" "All signs point to yes," Ramiro said. "She's either complicit or being blackmailed, but given her bank statements, I'd lean toward complicit. She's received significant donations that don't align with the orphanage's stated income." Antonio's voice was cold. "So, what's the plan?" Ramiro leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "We're closing in, but we need more. A direct link between the director and the trafficking operation. My team is working on it, but once we have enough, we'll move in quickly and decisively." Clara, who had joined them, voiced the concern they all shared. "What about Sophia? If this all goes public, won't she be at risk?" Ramiro nodded gravely. "That's why we're keeping this operation as quiet as possible. Once we move, I'll coordinate with Child Protective Services to ensure Sophia's case is handled discreetly. She won't go back to the system, not after this." Antonio's voice was firm. "Good. She deserves better than that." As the investigation intensified, so did the danger. Antonio couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, his instincts honed by years and high-stakes business deals now serving him in an entirely different arena. He doubled security around the estate, ensuring every entry point was monitored. Sophia, unaware of the full extent of the threat, began to adjust to her new life, her laughter occasionally breaking through the tension like sunlight through a storm. One afternoon, while Antonio and Clara were in the kitchen, Sophia wandered in, holding a drawing she had made. "It's us," she said shyly, handing it to Antonio. The crayon sketch depicted a smiling Antonio, Clara, and Sophia standing under a big tree. Antonio felt a lump in his throat as he looked at the drawing. "It's beautiful, Sophia," he said, his voice softer than usual. "We'll have to frame this." Clara smiled warmly, her eyes glistening. "You're so talented, sweetheart." Sophia beamed, her confidence growing with each passing day. For Antonio, moments like these reinforced his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for justice, he was fighting for her future. As night fell, Ramiro called with an update that set everyone on edge. "We've confirmed a delivery scheduled for tomorrow night," he said. "It's likely they're moving children out of the orphanage. If we act now, we can intercept them." Antonio's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you need from me?" "Stay with Sophia," Ramiro instructed. "She's the reason we know about this. I'll handle the raid, but you need to ensure she's safe. If they suspect she's here, they might retaliate." Antonio's voice was resolute. "Understood. Just promise me one thing. Don't let them get away." Ramiro's voice was equally determined. "I won't. Not this time." As Antonio hung up, his gaze shifted to the window overlooking the estate's expansive grounds. The shadows outside seemed darker than usual, the weight of the impending confrontation pressing down on him, but he pushed the fear aside, his resolve unshaken. For Sophia, he would face whatever came next. The tension was palpable as the team gathered in a discreet safe house on the outskirts of the city. Detective Ramiro stood at the head of the room, a map of the orphanage and its surrounding area pinned to the wall behind him. His voice was calm but laced with urgency as he laid out the plan. "Tonight we move in," Ramiro began, his sharp gaze cutting through the dimly lit room. "The evidence we've gathered confirms that Ernesto Aguilar, known as Mr. Leon, is the leader of this trafficking network. The orphanage is his base of operations, and our sources indicate he's there tonight with his inner circle." Antonio, seated in the corner with Clara beside him, clenched his fists at the mention of Aguilar's name. The revelations from Ramiro's investigation had sickened him. Accounts of children being sold like commodities, their lives shattered for profit. It was the kind of evil Antonio had never imagined he'd confront. Ramiro continued, pointing to the map. "The raid will happen in 2 phases. My team will secure the perimeter and cut off any escape routes. The second team will enter the orphanage, apprehend Aguilar and his associates, and extract any children still inside." Clara, her hands folded tightly in her lap, spoke up. "And Sophia? What happens if Aguilar realizes she's the one who escaped?" Ramiro's expression softened. "Sophia is safe. She's under constant surveillance at Antonio's estate, and we've taken every precaution to ensure no one can trace her location. But her testimony will be crucial to securing convictions. Once we have Aguilar, we'll finalize her statement and close this case for good." Antonio's voice cut through the room, low and firm. "Make sure you bring every last one of them down, Ramiro." Ramiro nodded solemnly. "We will." As night fell, Antonio sat in his study, staring out the window at the moonlit grounds of his estate. Sophia had already been tucked into bed, unaware of the danger unfolding elsewhere. Clara sat across from him, her eyes heavy with worry. "They'll succeed, won't they?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Antonio nodded, though his own doubts gnawed at him. "Ramiro's the best. If anyone can do this, it's him." Despite his confidence, Antonio couldn't shake the image of Sophia's small frame trembling as she described Pedro, a boy taken from the orphanage just days before her escape. The pain in her voice had been unbearable, her guilt palpable, as she whispered, "I couldn't save him." Now it was their turn to act. At the orphanage, Ramiro's team moved like shadows through the darkness. The building loomed ahead, its facade deceptively quiet under the pale moonlight. Ramiro signaled his team to take their positions, each member equipped with night vision goggles and tactical gear. The operation had to be precise. One misstep could alert Aguilar and send him fleeing. Inside, the orphanage was eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of mildew and despair. Ramiro's second team breached the entrance, their movements swift and calculated. Flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the grim interior, peeling paint, broken furniture, and the faint sound of muffled cries echoing down the hall. Ramiro's voice crackled through the comms. "Team 1, perimeter secure. Team 2, proceed." The second team advanced, their weapons at the ready. In one of the back rooms, they found Aguilar, seated at a desk, surrounded by papers and cash-stuffed envelopes. He looked up sharply, his face contorting in rage as the team stormed in. "Ernesto Aguilar," one of the officers barked, "you're under arrest!" Aguilar's hand darted toward a drawer, but Ramiro's voice cut through the chaos. "Don't even think about it, Aguilar," he commanded, stepping into the room. His weapon was trained on Aguilar, his steady aim leaving no room for negotiation. Aguilar froze, his jaw tightening as he raised his hands. "You have no idea what you're doing," he sneered. "I'll be out by morning." Ramiro smirked coldly. "Not this time. We've got enough evidence to bury you." As Aguilar was cuffed and led out of the room, other officers began searching the orphanage, uncovering a hidden basement where several children were found huddled together. The sight of their wide, terrified eyes hardened Ramiro's resolve. "Get them out of here," he ordered, "and make sure they're taken somewhere safe." One of the officers approached with a folder they'd confiscated from Aguilar's desk. Inside were detailed records of the trafficking operation, including payments and destinations. Ramiro's eyes narrowed as he scanned the documents. This was the smoking gun they needed. Hours later, as dawn broke over the city, Ramiro arrived at Antonio's estate. He was exhausted but triumphant, his jacket dusted with the remnants of the raid. Antonio and Clara were waiting for him in the living room, their faces a mix of hope and anxiety. "We got him," Ramiro announced, sinking into an armchair. "Aguilar and several of his accomplices are in custody. The children we found are safe, and we've secured enough evidence to shut down the entire network." And Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hand flying to her chest. "Thank God!" Antonio's shoulders relaxed, though his expression remained serious. "And Sophia? What happens next?" Ramiro leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Sophia's testimony is going to be critical. Her account of Pedro and her escape will connect the dots between the orphanage and the trafficking network. It'll seal the case against Aguilar." Antonio nodded. "She'll do it. She's stronger than she realizes." Ramiro's gaze softened. "You've done a good job keeping her safe. Now, we'll make sure justice is served." Later that morning, Antonio climbed the stairs to Sophia's room. He knocked gently before pushing the door open. Sophia was sitting on the bed, clutching a stuffed animal Clara had brought her. She looked up, her eyes searching his face. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. Antonio sat beside her, his large frame making the bed dip slightly. "Almost," he said. "The bad man is gone, Sophia. He can't hurt anyone anymore." Sophia's lower lip quivered. "What about Pedro? Did they find him?" Antonio hesitated, not wanting to give her false hope. "They found some of the children," he said carefully, "but Ramiro is still looking for Pedro, and we're going to do everything we can to find him." Sophia nodded, her small hand reaching for his. "Thank you," she whispered, "for helping me." Antonio swallowed the lump in his throat. "You're not alone anymore, Sophia. We'll make sure you're safe, and that no one else has to go through what you did." As the sun rose higher in the sky, Antonio felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Together, they would face whatever came next. The days following the raid were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and emotional reckonings. Sophia, once so timid and fearful, now found herself thrust into a spotlight she never sought. Under the guidance of Detective Ramiro and lawyer Valdez, her testimony became the linchpin in the case against Ernesto Aguilar. Antonio watched from the sidelines, his heart heavy as Sophia sat in the witness chair at the courthouse. Her small frame seemed dwarfed by the imposing courtroom, but her voice, though shaky, carried the weight of truth. She recounted everything she had overheard and witnessed at the orphanage, her words painting a grim picture of the horrors she had escaped. "I heard them say they were going to take Pedro," Sophia said, her voice breaking. "They said someone would pay a lot of money for him." Her tears came unbidden, but she pushed through, her bravery evident even as the courtroom fell silent. Antonio felt a swell of pride and sorrow, his hands gripping the edge of the bench as he willed her strength to hold. After the testimony, Sophia ran straight into Antonio's arms, her sobs muffled against his chest. "It's over now," he whispered, holding her tightly. "You were so brave, Sophia. So incredibly brave." Clara knelt beside them, wiping her own tears as she gently stroked Sophia's hair. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart." With the trial underway and Aguilar facing a near-certain conviction, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Sophia, now legally adopted by Antonio, found herself surrounded by love and security for the first time in her life. The sprawling estate that had once felt so cold and impersonal was transformed into a home filled with warmth and laughter. Rather than linger on the mundane details of their daily lives, the story focused on pivotal moments that marked their journey as a family. One crisp autumn afternoon, Antonio and Clara sat poolside, watching as Sophia participated in her first swimming competition. The girl who had once trembled at every shadow now moved with confidence and determination, her strokes cutting through the water like a natural athlete. As Sophia touched the wall first in the final lap, the crowd erupted into cheers. Antonio stood, clapping loudly, his chest swelling with pride. Clara wiped a tear from her cheek, beaming as Sophia climbed out of the pool and ran toward them, dripping from ear to ear. "This is for you," Sophia exclaimed, holding up the gold medal she had just won. "For both of you." Antonio crouched to her level, his hands resting on her shoulders. "You earned this, Sophia. We're just lucky to be here to see it." Clara pulled her into a tight hug, whispering, "You've made us so proud." Sophia's smile widened as she held the medal tightly. For the first time, she felt like she belonged, not just to a family, but to a world where her achievements were celebrated and her voice mattered. One evening, after a long day, the three of them gathered in the living room. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room as Antonio worked on his laptop and Clara read a book. Sophia sat cross-legged on the floor, crayons scattered around her as she worked intently on a drawing. "What are you making, Sophia?" Clara asked, peeking over her book. "It's a surprise," Sophia replied, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated. When she finally held up the paper, both Antonio and Clara paused to admire it. The drawing depicted a cozy house surrounded by trees and flowers, with a large heart above the roof. In front of the house stood 3 figures: Antonio, Clara, and Sophia, all smiling and holding hands. "This is our home," Sophia said proudly. Her voice softened as she added, "I never want to leave it." Antonio's throat tightened as he took the drawing from her hands, his thumb brushing over the crayon heart. "You'll never have to," he said firmly. "This is your home, Sophia, forever." Clara wrapped an arm around Sophia, pulling her close. "You've made it complete," she said softly. Sophia leaned into the embrace, her small frame radiating contentment. "I love you both," she whispered. As the seasons changed, so did Sophia. The girl who had once been afraid of her own shadow now laughed freely, her joy infectious. Antonio and Clara watched with wonder as she blossomed, her resilience and courage inspiring them in ways they hadn't expected. The finalization of the adoption marked a turning point. The judge's words, declaring Sophia officially part of their family, brought tears to all their eyes. That night, Antonio held a small celebration at the estate, inviting Clara and a few close friends who had supported them throughout the ordeal. Sophia beamed as Antonio toasted to her new beginning. "To Sophia," he said, raising his glass, "the bravest, kindest, and most remarkable daughter we could ever ask for." The room erupted in applause as Sophia blushed, her smile lighting up the room. Though the scars of her past would never fully fade, Sophia's journey of healing had begun in earnest. Antonio and Clara, once strangers to her pain, now stood as unwavering pillars of support. Together they faced the challenges ahead, bound by a love that had grown through hardship and triumph. As the fire crackled low one quiet night, Antonio tucked Sophia into bed. She clutched the stuffed animal Clara had given her, her eyes heavy with sleep. "Good night, Daddy," she murmured, the words slipping out naturally. Antonio froze, his heart swelling. It was the first time she had called him that. He leaned down, brushing a kiss against her forehead. "Good night, Sophia," he whispered. "Sweet dreams." As he turned out the light and closed the door, Antonio felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. In saving Sophia, he realized, she had also saved him. Together they had built something unbreakable, a family. The courtroom was packed on the day of Ernesto Aguilar's trial, the air thick with tension. Aguilar sat at the defense table, his demeanor calm and calculating. He had hired an aggressive legal team, their strategy clear, to discredit the evidence against him and, most cruelly, to undermine Sophia's testimony. Sophia, now sitting at the witness stand, looked impossibly small under the harsh glare of the courtroom lights. Antonio and Clara sat in the gallery, their eyes never leaving her. They knew this was the most difficult moment of her journey, but they also knew her strength. Detective Ramiro and Mr. Valdez sat nearby, their presence a steady reassurance. The defense lawyer wasted no time. "Miss Sophia," he began, his voice smooth but patronizing, "you've been through a great deal of trauma, haven't you?" Sophia nodded, her small hands gripping the edge of the stand. And trauma," the lawyer continued, pacing before the jury, "can sometimes make people misremember events, can't it?" Sophia hesitated, her gaze darting to Antonio, who gave her a slight nod. She took a breath, her voice steady as she answered, "I know what I heard. I know what they were going to do to us." though the lawyer pressed on, his tone growing sharper. "But isn't it possible that you misunderstood, that perhaps you overheard something out of context?" Sophia's eyes narrowed, her chin lifting slightly. "No," she said firmly. "They were talking about selling Pedro. They said someone would pay a lot of money for him. I heard them say it, and I saw them take him." The lawyer paused, clearly frustrated by her composure. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this child's testimony is unreliable." Before he could finish, the prosecutor stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is badgering the witness." "Sustained," the judge said firmly. "Move on, counselor." As the trial progressed, the weight of the evidence against Aguilar became impossible to ignore. Financial records, witness statements from the rescued children, and Sophia's testimony painted a damning picture. Aguilar's calm facade began to crack as Detective Ramiro took the stand, detailing the raid and the incriminating documents found in Aguilar's office. When it was time for closing arguments, the prosecutor's words echoed through the courtroom. "Sophia's bravery in coming forward has ensured that no other child will endure what she and so many others have suffered. Ernesto Aguilar exploited the most vulnerable for profit, and now it's time for justice." The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the verdict. Ernesto Aguilar is found guilty of all charges, including human trafficking, conspiracy, and child endangerment. Sentencing will follow, but let it be known that this court will impose the maximum penalty allowed by law. The gallery erupted in whispers and quiet cheers. Antonio felt Clara's hand on his, her grip tight as tears streamed down her face. He glanced at Sophia, who sat still for a moment, as if processing the enormity of what had just happened. Then, slowly, a small, triumphant smile spread across her face. With Aguilar behind bars, life took on a new lightness. A week later, Antonio and Clara finalized Sophia's adoption, the moment marked by a private ceremony at the courthouse. The judge, who oversaw the case, clearly moved by Sophia's story, presided over the proceedings. "You are officially Sophia De Luca," the judge announced with a warm smile. "Congratulations to the De Luca family." Sophia beamed as Antonio lifted her into a hug, spinning her around while Clara clapped and cheered. Detective Ramiro and Mr. Valdez stood nearby, both men smiling broadly. "You've got a remarkable daughter," Ramiro said, shaking Antonio's hand. "She's the remarkable one," Antonio replied, his voice thick with emotion. That evening, Antonio hosted a celebration at his estate. The house was filled with warmth and laughter, a stark contrast to the tense days they had endured together. Clara had decorated the dining room with balloons and banners, and Sophia had insisted on baking a cake with her own hands, a slightly lopsided but delicious creation that she proudly displayed in the center of the table. As the guests gathered, Sophia stood on a chair to make a toast. Holding her glass of sparkling cider high, she said, "Thank you, everyone, for helping me, for giving me a home. I love you all." Antonio and Clara exchanged a glance, their hearts full. Antonio stepped forward, placing a hand on Sophia's shoulder. "And we love you, Sophia. You've changed our lives in ways we can't even describe. You're not just part of this family. You are this family." The room erupted in applause, tears glistening in more than a few eyes. As the night wound down, Antonio sat with Sophia in the living room, the quiet hum of the celebration fading as the guests began to leave. Sophia curled up beside him, her head resting against his chest. "Do you feel different?" Antonio asked softly. Sophia looked up at him, her eyes shining. "No," she said with a small smile. "I've felt like this was my family for a long time." Antonio felt his chest tighten as he kissed the top of her head. "And it always will be." As the stars twinkled outside, Antonio realized that their journey, though fraught with hardship, had led them to this moment. a moment of peace, love, and hope for the future. Together, they had not only survived but thrived, building a life that was stronger and brighter than any of them could have imagined. If you find the story we bring today interesting, please comment "Great." If you feel the story is not attractive, please comment "Need more drama."